our hearts, both as researchers in neuroscience and as citizens of a global world in the depth of a global pandemic. So here to address our pressing questions about the effects of COVID-19 on the brain, we have four incredible panelists joining us from right here in London, the States, and from all the way out in Australia. So to begin, we've asked each panelist to briefly discuss their research related to COVID-19 and the effects on the brain. Please feel free to keep the chat going with questions, and we'll get around to addressing them following the sort of mini talks or presentations. So without further ado, Sarah and I will now introduce our panelists.
So we're going to start with introducing Dr. Shibani Mukherjee. I apologize if I pronounced that incorrectly. I hope I got that right. She's the Associate Director of Neurology Infectious Diseases Unit at Massachusetts General Hospital and Assistant Professor of Neurology at Harvard Medical School. She received her undergraduate degree from Yale University and her MD and PhD in neuroscience from the Case Western Reserve University School of Medicine. Since March, Dr. Mukherjee has led efforts to improve understanding of neurological manifestations of COVID-19 across the Massachusetts General Brigham Hospital networks. She's co-authored 8 research and opinion publications and given numerous talks on the topic of neurological manifestations of COVID. Her research interests are in integration of patient-derived data, including clinical, laboratory, neuroimaging, and metabolite profiling to improve therapeutic targeting of neurological comorbidities in people with HIV. Dr. Mukherjee is supported by the National Institute of Health for her research investigating immune activation, cerebral metabolic activity, and depression in treated HIV infection.
And next we have Dr. Sonu Bhaskar. Again, I apologize if I mispronounced. So Dr. Bhaskar is a clinician scientist and academic neurologist with a specialization in vascular neurology and neuroradiology. His research interests include global neurology, health systems, and public health. Dr. Bhaskar is the founding director of the world's first brain clot bank. He is the 2-time winner of the prestigious European Academy of Neurology Investigator Award and Rotary Vocational Excellence Award. Dr. Bhaskar leads national and international initiatives on reducing health disparities with a focus on vulnerable populations and under-resourced settings. During the COVID-19 pandemic, Dr. Bhaskar is leading the Pandemic Health System Resilience Program, or REProgram for short, which is an international consortium formed to champion the safety of healthcare workers, develop policies, and advocate for global pandemic preparedness and action. Dr. Bhaskar is kindly joining us at 7:30 a.m. on a Saturday morning in Australia, so a special thank you for that.
Next, we have Dr. Adrian Owen, who is a bit more local to us, and he is currently a professor of cognitive neuroscience and imaging at the University of Western Ontario. He also directs the Brain, Mind, and Consciousness program and is on the executive committee of BrainScan at Western. Dr. Owen was previously the assistant director of the Medical Research Council Cognition and Brain Sciences Unit at Cambridge University and the Canada Excellence Research Chair in Cognition, Neuroscience, and Imaging at Western University. Dr. Owen is best known for showing that functional neuroimaging can reveal conscious awareness in some patients who appear to be entirely vegetative state and can even allow some of these individuals to communicate their thoughts and wishes to the outside world. He has published over 300 peer-reviewed articles and chapters in a best-selling science book. In 2019, Dr. Owen was awarded Officer of the Most Excellent Order of the British Empire and the Queen's Honours List for services to scientific research.
All right, and last but not least, of course, is Dr. Robert Stevens. So Dr. Stevens is an intensive care physician who treats patients with critical surgical and neurological illnesses and injuries. He has special expertise in the care of traumatic brain injury, stroke, encephalopathy, and the management of patients after cardiac arrest. Following medical studies, Dr. Stevens completed residency in anesthesiology and fellowships in critical care medicine and neurocritical care. He also completed postdoctoral research training in molecular neurobiology, cellular electrophysiology, advanced magnetic resonance imaging, and brain mapping. He is Director of Precision Medicine for Anesthesiology and Critical Care Medicine and Associate Director of the Johns Hopkins Neurocritical Care Precision Medicine Center of Excellence. He holds faculty appointments in the Johns Hopkins Institute for Cell Engineering, Institute for Computational Medicine, and the F.M. Kirby Center for Functional Neuroimaging. Dr. Stevens holds leadership positions in the Society of Critical Care Medicine, European Society of Intensive Care Medicine, Society of Critical Care Anesthesiology, and Neurocritical Society.
So I would like to thank all you very accomplished researchers for joining us today, and I would like to open the floor to Dr. Mukherjee to start us off and explain a little bit more about what she does.
Perfect. Thank you. I appreciate the time, Sarah, and you said my name perfectly. Thank you.
Thank you.
I was going to say I do have slides, but maybe I could just simply talk about what my research is. And so one of the things that I've been investigating, or at least very interested in for a very long time, is how the virus and hosts interact. And I think about it in the context of HIV. I've thought about it in the context of Eastern equine encephalitis, which is an arbovirus that's sort of closely, involved here in the region in the Northeast. And we've thought about a little bit on how these viruses, these neuron-based viruses that we know affect the brain. And so one of the first things that we had done very early on was to look at autopsy cases. And so for us, just to give context, in Massachusetts, our first wave was in March of last year. We were after Washington State. We were also after New York. But by early March, we had our first cases. By the end of March, our hospitals were inundated. And by mid-April, we saw deaths. And so between April 14th to about April 26th, we had 18 cases of, unfortunately, people who had died, which just speaks to the atrocity of the disease. But, and that was in a single hospital. And in that series, our goal was to characterize what the pathology looked like. Surprisingly enough, at that time, we didn't have any understanding of what neuropathology should look like. We stopped at the 18 because it was pretty clear that the pattern was consistent no matter which case came in. And it was hypoxic ischemic damage for 100%, very little inflammation, minimal evidence on our hands for perivascular inflammation, no really evidence of vasculitis, things that we would think about for a tropic virus. In our hands, we did not identify virus in any of those cases. We did identify very little amount of viral RNA. When I say little, we're talking about single-digit copy numbers, despite a profound neuro presentation for some individuals. And in general, we don't know the cellular source. I think that picture of microvascular hypoxic ischemic injury, that sort of signature, has not changed that dramatically, I think, since the pandemic has come about, since we've had now over 150 autopsy cases of unique cases in brain pathology. We can have a discussion, in this group as well as everybody else, other people's findings, but in general, I think microvascular injury is probably a key core component, whether that's COVID specific versus other etiologies that we can also have a discussion on. I'm interested in hearing what Dr. Owen says about sort of the neuroimaging and sort of radiographic findings there. We've done some work as well trying to understand, but the big key thing in our lab has always been about not everybody is going to have the same neuroradiographic images, neuroradiographic signatures, the same pathology. And so what are some of those host factors that drive what we see, I think is extremely important. And so again, host interactions, I think will be a key thing. So that's what my lab does. We do also look at not big data, but clinical data and trying to identify that. So happy to talk to anybody about those studies as well.
Thanks so much, Dr. Mukherjee. Super interesting stuff, and looking forward to the discussion that we get out of this. So next, I'll ask Dr. Bhaskar to talk about his research.
Thank you, Rubina. It's a pleasure joining you guys, and thank you all the panelists for coming together on such an important topic. It's down under in Australia, so you probably imagine it's 6:30 in the morning. I caught up, so forgive my if I forget to acknowledge some of the panelists here. But I'll begin with some of the work that we've been doing in a COVID-19 pandemic since it started in March and February in Australia. So we've looked at three important approaches to tackle the problem. One was the time. As you probably know, at the initial phase of the COVID pandemic, we saw patients presenting, and the number of presentations to the emergency department and to the neurology wards were dramatically reduced in relative to the previous year. So we were looking at whether we can improve the public perception of cerebrovascular accident, and importantly, that these patients need acute care should they have a stroke and a cerebrovascular accident. So really reminding people about the time is brain, and important to bring along and come to the clinic and get the treatment, endovascular thrombectomy or the thrombolysis as is required and appropriate for the patient. The second approach we were looking at was an imaging-based approach, so that's a tissue-based approach, looking at how COVID-19 impacts the brain. So perfusion imaging, angiography, and high definition structural imaging to look at the different anatomical and the radiological correlates of COVID-19. And last but not the least, that was an international consortium. We're building together the health system's capacity in developing countries, and we touched base about 25 countries in Asia and Africa. And the target there was for the health system neurological facilities which are not capable enough, we bring the expertise from the developed world and support the neurological facilities in those countries to tackle COVID-19 associated neurological manifestations, but most importantly, even the critical care in those countries. So that's the TTS approach that I was wanted to discuss about. Now, so before we go into the panel discussion, for the general audience who might not be aware of some of the important findings, this has been released by recent studies. So I'll just summarize the neurological manifestations. As you probably know, that since the beginning of the pandemic, approximately half of the hospitalized COVID-19 patients do have a neurological manifestation. And prominent of those are the myalgia, headache, and encephalopathy, and stroke, of course. My particular interest is in stroke, and we are witnessing more cases with multi-vessel stroke, which is quite interesting, bilateral at times. And it was interesting to see that those findings are consistent even in Philadelphia with Pascal Zabur, who I collaborate very closely with in US. Now, in case of, so just to summarize before we kickstart the panel discussion and also hear Dr. Owen and Dr. Stevens, I must accept that our knowledge of neurological effects of COVID-19 is constantly evolving. And among the neurological manifestations, most prominent of them are anosmia, encephalopathy, encephalitis, and some recent cases about Guillain-Barré syndrome. But to be honest, we devil's advocate. I think the neurological manifestations relatively, if you compare that with cases with mild and moderate cases, in the severe cases are much more pronounced. And I think these are the cases which we're looking at very closely. But secondly, the cases which are mild, even moderate, the longitudinal monitoring would be so important in order to understand the natural progression of COVID-19 and then to design appropriate treatment algorithms as and when required. So an important, as you probably would have the long COVID term very often these days. So looking at the neurological sequelae over time. So, so looking forward to the discussion now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bhaskar. I'm really looking forward to this discussion. Next, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Adrian Owen to hear a bit more about his work.
Thanks very much. I'm just going to try and share my screen. All right, how about that? Is that good?
Yeah, looks perfect.
Excellent. Right. Well, thanks so much for inviting me to speak today about what I know about COVID-19. I'm not an expert. What I do, as you said in your introduction, is investigate brain function and dysfunction. I have a particular long-standing interest in cognition and how anything that disrupts normal brain function can affect cognition. I'm going to just spend 5 or 6 minutes, if I can, telling you about a study we're running at the moment and some very preliminary results, because hopefully they'll feed into some of the comments that you've just heard from Dr. Bhaskar. So, as you just heard, COVID-19 affects the brain. Patients often present with neurological symptoms. Most people will have heard of the loss of smell being a very common neurological symptom, as well as things like headaches, blurred vision, strokes are on the increase, but also seizures and delirium have been reported. As I've already said, what I'm really interested in is impaired cognition. And anybody who has spent 5 minutes looking at one of the long COVID or COVID survivors Facebook groups, for example, will know that many people are anecdotally reporting brain fog. As cognitive neuroscientists, we really don't understand what brain fog means. And that's really one of the key questions that we would like to try and investigate. Now, there are many ways that COVID-19 can affect brain function. I'm going to broadly call them either direct effects or indirect effects. And by direct effects, we mean the virus actually invading and affecting brain tissue itself. And I have to say, I think the jury is still out on what the direct effects of COVID-19 on the brain are. But I noticed yesterday, this preprint was put up by, led by a Canadian group, really interesting. It summarizes the literature. If you're interested in this, it summarizes it very well. And I've just got I've just highlighted the sort of take home down there, which is that COVID-19 can afflict acute neuropathology in susceptible patients, but of course, much remains to be understood, including whether it's cleared from the brain subsequent to acute illness. Indirect effects. Now, there are many potential indirects of COVID-19 on the indirect effects, and that's because basically anything that affects the oxygen supply to the brain will affect brain function and therefore could possibly have an effect on cognition. And this can include low oxygen levels, sedation, an interrupt to the oxygen supply when patients, for example, are put on ventilators, or even just spending time in the ICU. And here's an example of what we do know about this. This was a paper we published in 2019, looking at a group of ICU survivors. Of course, this was pre-COVID-19, but all the patients in this study were not admitted to the ICU for a specific brain problem. They had all sorts of other things wrong with them. Nevertheless, all of them, when they left the ICU, had cognitive challenges. So for whatever reason, could be being on a ventilator, could be lack of sleep, could be heavy sedation, could be any of the other effects of consequences of just being in the ICU. Clearly, it does generally or can lead to cognitive deficits. So trying to understand some of these things, we've launched this study at covidbrainstudy.com. We launched in June of last year. And the idea was to try and get as many COVID survivors as we could to log into our website and answer a lot of questions about the experiences they'd had, the severity of their symptoms, whether they've been hospitalized, sedated, ventilated, so on and so forth, as well as carry out a battery of online cognitive tests. And these are tests of things like memory, concentration, planning, reasoning, problem solving. And these tests are hosted on the Cambridge Brain Sciences platform, which is a set of 12 short tasks that were developed in my lab here at Western. They're all short tasks, and as I say, they measure things like working memory, attention, reasoning, decision-making, and so on. The great thing about them is they've been around for many years. Over 10 million tests have been conducted. So we know a lot about how healthy people perform on these tasks, which makes it a really good tool for looking at individuals with something new like COVID-19 and trying to determine, well, is this person performing normally, or are they performing abnormally? I won't go into any more details about the Cambridge Brain Sciences platform, but it's deployed completely over the web. So again, we weren't really in a position to bring people in, people with COVID-19 and assess them in the lab. So it's very convenient that we could assess them over the internet. For those of you who are curious, here's a quick example of somebody performing one of the tests. This is a test of deductive reasoning called the odd one out. And of course, the idea is just to find the pattern that is the odd one out. Don't get too excited. You're looking at really easy problems right now. It does very quickly get much harder. Or hopefully you all realize that right there, that one was the odd one out. So, excuse me, that was the wrong button. Right, let's move. Right, so these are some of the key questions we're trying to look at. Does COVID-19 infection result in significant cognitive impairment? And if so, what types of cognition are most affected? Again, this is to try to break apart this concept of brain fog. What does it really mean? What about severity? Is cognitive impairment worse in those who require an ICU stay versus those, for example, who may... Is it only those people who are ventilated and sedated, the most severe people? What about timing? I'm not going to be able to answer this question today, but we're following these patients longitudinally for a whole year. And what we want to know is, if we do find cognitive deficits, do they get better over time? Are they stable? Or in fact, do they get worse? Could it be like a neurodegenerative condition where patients actually get worse as time progresses? And of course, we want to look at all these factors like sex, age, medical risk factors, and other underlying factors. I've just got a couple more things. I'm just going to give you some very sort of preliminary results, so I actually have something concrete to talk about. This really is hot off the press. What we did, and this is from the first 500 or 600 patients that have participated in the study, what we did is we divided them up according to the World Health Organization designation of severity, and that basically goes from 0, completely asymptomatic and staying out of hospital, to a 6, where you're in hospital, you're in the ICU, and you are on ventilation. We divided our group up into those, and what we found, and these are just a few little tidbits really. So increasing severity, this probably wouldn't surprise many people, is strongly associated with subjectively poorer memory rating. So one of the things we ask people is, do you feel that your memory is impaired relative to prior to COVID infection? And as you can see, there's a very nice relationship between the severity of symptoms and people's subjective experience of memory. Now, that's not what we were testing with the Cambridge Brain Sciences test. That's a more objective measure. This is just how did people feel. This also will probably not surprise people if you read the news lately. Increasing COVID severity was also strongly associated with increases in anxiety and depression. So we also included anxiety questionnaires and depression questionnaires, and the worse your COVID symptoms, the more likely you are to report symptoms of anxiety and depression. Now, this gets a little bit more complicated, and I'm not going to attempt to go into this in any great detail. But these are just some of the things that we assessed with our questionnaire. Things like whether people reported fatigue or pain. I've talked about anxiety, depression, subjective memory already, COVID severity. We asked people whether they felt they were back to baseline cognitive function, etc. And what this graph shows is that it's essentially there are 2 factors that best describe all of our data. And one of them, which is signified by the inner ring here, you can think of as being physical symptoms. It's whether people feel their physical functioning isn't back to how it was, whether they still have any physical limitations following COVID severity. Also, of course, physical symptoms, COVID severity is part of that factor as well. Then there's a second factor, which is the outer ring here, which looks more like mental health symptoms. And obviously there you've got anxiety and depression, but you've also got things like whether people feel that they've been emotionally affected by the experience, whether they're experiencing fatigue. Now, what we found is really interesting. Now, obviously, what you're looking at in the middle of this ring are the associations between these different different components of people's reported performance. So obviously physical limitations and physical functioning are very highly correlated, but physical functioning and emotional limitations are hardly correlated at all. And the really interesting thing, and this is the central finding I think to come out of this study, is that only one of those factors is associated with cognitive deficits. Now, I've neglected to say, and I should have said already, that of course we are seeing profound cognitive impairments across the board in patients who are recovering from COVID. But what's really interesting, at least it's what I think is really interesting, is that the cognitive impairments are linked to the physical symptoms, not to the mental health symptoms. So I'm not going to go into any detail about what this shows other than factor 1. F1 is the physical symptomology, and F2, factor 2, is the mental health symptomology. And just to sort of sum up, there's a lot of words on this final slide, and you don't have to read them all. But basically, what we're finding is that there based on an extensive questionnaire, people reporting their post-COVID experience. There are the responses to those questionnaires can be broadly characterized into two components, if you like. One is very physical, that is fatigue, pain, affected activities of daily living, and so on. And one was much more related to mental health components, such as feelings of depression and anxiety. Now, that's not to say there are two types of people. This is like a Venn diagram. You can have a bit of both, but the data can best be explained in terms of these two factors. And what we're finding is that it's the physical factor that is driving the cognitive deficits, not the mental health factors. And this is interesting because obviously depression, anxiety, these conditions outside of COVID-19 are associated with cognitive impairments. But what we're seeing here is that the worse your physical symptoms, the worse your cognitive outcome is likely to be, whereas the cognitive outcome is somewhat dissociable from these other mental health aspects like depression and anxiety. So in a sense, we might be here looking at two types of COVID outcome, one that primarily affects physical health and produces cognitive deficits, and the other that primarily affects mental health. But as I say, this is a work in progress. This is literally, this data was being analysed even earlier today. So we have we have a lot to do. And this is I've got some fantastic group of people working with Connor Wild, Loretta Norton in particular here in London, Ontario, have put in a lot of work to this data. And I should say, it's funded by CIFAR, the Canadian Institute for Advanced Research. Thank you. Sorry, I took more time than I should, but I wanted to try and give you a little snapshot of what we're working on right now.
Awesome. Yeah, no apologies needed. That was wonderful. Thanks so much for sharing those preliminary results with us. I'm sure it'll generate lots of discussion here today. So next we have Dr. Stevens. So I'll invite you now to share your research as well.
Yeah, so thank you, Rubina and Sarah for hosting me. This is great to be on this panel. I have to acknowledge that I'm a relative latecomer to the COVID research domain. I kind of deliberately stayed aloof from COVID research, thinking that this pandemic was going to resolve quickly, and realizing now that it's maybe here to stay. I've been pulled into a few research projects which I can share with you. So I guess first of all, I can just relate some personal professional experiences since I've been taking care of COVID patients now for nearly a year. And it's quite striking. I've been primarily involved in the care of patients admitted to the intensive care unit. I'm an intensivist. And we saw from the outset that a very high proportion of these patients became rapidly ill, developed multi-system organ failure, and that multi-system organ involvement affected the brain. So we were seeing extraordinarily high proportions of COVID-19 patients with encephalopathy, meaning a global disturbance in brain function, and then a subset who presented with focal neurological deficits and were found to have, in most cases, either ischemic or hemorrhagic strokes. And these early findings, of which we were already beginning to see in March and April of last year, led a few of us to decide to put together a consortium. So we created, with the auspices of the Neurocritical Care Society, the Global Consortium Study of Neuro-COVID, which is one out of many, actually, consortia looking at neurological manifestations in COVID. And in the meantime, I've been actually asked to participate in several other of these consortia. The goal of most of these research consortia is to gather data so that we can gain insights on the relationship between the virus and neurological manifestations, which clearly is a complex issue, as outlined in the very nice slides from Dr. Owen. So more recently, several members of my lab have gained a foothold in this research and have convinced me that we perhaps should invest some time and effort. And in fact, we recently got some funding to look at COVID in a very large data set of patients admitted to the Johns Hopkins health system over the past year. So we have a data set of close to 100,000 patients, and among whom about 12,000 were hospitalized. So what we've been doing is essentially applying data science methodology. So my research is primarily in the field of neuroscience, clinical neuroscience, imaging, brain mapping. But more recently, I've also become very interested in big data and implementing analytical methodologies such as statistical learning and machine learning to better parse through these very complex high-dimensional data sets. So we have this huge data set of patients with COVID-19 here at Johns Hopkins, and we've implemented 3 different studies. One of them is to retrospectively analyze the neurological signs and symptoms, as well as the imaging, as well as the serum biomarkers in a subset of patients who were admitted to the Johns Hopkins system. And those data are currently being analyzed. I don't have any preliminary results, unfortunately. The second study is to examine the dynamic nature of COVID and to try to build a computational model to predict transitions in the neurologic state of patients admitted with COVID-19. So what we're doing essentially is leveraging the data available from the electronic health records as well as imaging to predict specific trajectories. So for example, development of coma, development of delirium, development of focal neurological deficits, development of seizures, stroke, ischemic stroke, and hemorrhagic stroke. And in our, we've run several iterations of this. And again, I don't have any slides to share, but we have a model that is actually that uses essentially the data available on admission and predicts with a fairly high degree of accuracy whether or not a patient will develop a neurological syndrome and what kind of neurological syndrome. So this is very exciting. It's preliminary, but we think it could be very helpful to clinicians to leverage these types of computational models to predict COVID trajectories. The third area that I think is perhaps the most interesting is to acknowledge that COVID-19 is a extraordinarily heterogeneous disorder, right? So we know that there's heterogeneity in disease transmission, there's heterogeneity in susceptibility to the disease, there's heterogeneity in individual trajectories. So it seems almost like no 2 people infected with COVID are alike. Some people will have a very benign course without any symptoms whatsoever, and others will go on to develop multi-system organ failure and come to my intensive care unit. And we don't have, unfortunately, a good grasp of how to account for this incredibly diverse nature of the COVID presentation and COVID trajectories. So I think one approach to reduce this complexity and potentially make sense of the heterogeneity is to implement a type of machine learning that is called unsupervised learning, where you can essentially comb through very large amounts of data and using methods such as clustering, you can identify subgroups or subsets that are more homogeneous, that share a certain biological mechanism, that share a certain disease trajectory, a certain outcome, and may even share a response to therapy. So this work is actually ongoing right now. We're in the process of identifying specific subphenotypes of COVID-19. And among those subphenotypes, we have 2 that actually have very prominent neurological symptoms. And so we feel that this approach of potentially trying to isolate subsets or subphenotypes, or we could call them also endophenotypes of COVID-19, is potentially very, very useful in terms of better parsing through the heterogeneity of this disease, which is an extraordinary challenge for many clinicians. So those are some of the efforts that are ongoing in my lab. I think it's I sort of came into this, I stumbled into this at a late phase just a few months ago, and in spite of my initial reservations, it's turning out to be extraordinarily interesting. But maybe the next time we meet, I'll be able to present you with some of our data.
Thank you so much for sharing that. It's super interesting to hear about the ongoing research that's actually happening right now from all of you guys. So now we're going to move on to questions. So people from the audience are welcome to type their questions into chat or raise your hand and we will call on you and you can unmute or let us know if you don't have a mic and we can ask for you. But I'll open the floor with a question. So many patients who have died from COVID-19 suffered from comorbidities which could impact their neurological structures, such as diabetes, causing similar damage to the microvasculature. How do you determine the proportion of contribution of each disease to the symptomology when looking at the autopsies? And I'll start by passing this off to Dr. Mukherjee.
That sounds like a me. Okay. If you don't mind, I'm going to share my screen because I hope that this will be helpful. And let me just take a look. And tell me if you can see my screen here.
Yep, we can see it.
Okay, so the question I think is perfect. And can you see a presenter screen or what do you see?
We see the one with your notes on it.
All right, so not a big deal. You can see the ones with it's just the bigger question as well. Let's take a look and see.
Sorry, just a quick thing. When you do that, there's a thing at the top called swap displays that might.
Ah, brilliant. Thank you. I always forget where that is.
Oh, it looks good now. Perfect.
Great. Thanks. So that's a phenomenal question. I think there's difficult to tease out. So you're absolutely right. Probably the majority of our cases in multiple series, and this is just the first 18, but we've got now several others where, as you can see, that the individuals with the neurological history were the predominant. So these are 18 individuals. 11 out of those 18 had chronic conditions, hypertension, diabetes, and chronic conditions. A lot of them actually did have vascular diseases that did affect the CNS, so past history of stroke is the most common. We can identify past history of atherosclerosis or arteriosclerosis when you look at sort of the old remodeled ischemic areas, and so versus new ischemic areas, so that's absolutely true. The key thing that you can identify in these cases now, majority of these individuals, average age was, sort of in the 70s, and so the key thing there is that it's not surprising that when you look deep down, you'll find atherosclerotic disease. Having said that, there is this large proportion of individuals. You can see sort of this heat map on the side. I think what is unclear, and I'm very grateful for Dr. Stevens and Dr. Basker's commentary that they're doing these global consortia, because the answer of the question is these individuals are very unique subset. They are already biased in some way. They are fatal. They've had a severe critical illness. And so they are not, it's hard to generalize, I think, to the entire cohort of what someone's going through who may have had mild COVID. So take that with a grain of salt a little bit. But the question, I think, a little bit is, yes, we can tease apart old infarcts versus new, old items versus new. But I would have to say that the additional comment is that, yes, the vast majority did have hypertension was the most common. Diabetes is another common condition that you will identify in autopsy series.
Okay, thanks so much, Dr. Mukherjee. For the attendees, don't be shy. Please feel free to raise your hand and ask questions in the chat. But I'll move on to another question here that's for Dr. Busker. So you published some papers outlining how the pandemic disproportionately affects various populations, such as healthcare workers, different ethnic groups, etc. So what do you think the most important lesson is that we've gotten from this pandemic about the effects on various populations? And do you think these issues are being addressed well?
Thank you for asking that question. Before I go there, let me just compliment Dr. Mukherjee's comment there. And I do agree that, that COVID patients who are more likely to be critically ill or have the most severe condition with COVID are more likely to be those multifactorial or multi-comorbid patients. So they have cardiovascular disease, obesity, diabetes, you name it, and you have it. And so it's just, you got to remember, it's always, the patient doesn't come just with the diabetes, probably would also come with hypercholesterolemia, so on and so forth. So the multifactorial nature of the disease is to be recognized. Now, with regards to the second question about the socioeconomic determinants and And I think Dr. Owen can complement this question in more detail, but as you know, probably the British Parliament established a national commission to inquire about the disproportionate deaths among the BAME community physicians in UK. So at the start of the pandemic and towards the mid of June, the Parliament debate happened, and across in many other countries, which where the BAME community, also in Australia, there was an increasing incidence of higher increased number of deaths and morbidity among physicians and healthcare frontline workers from the BAME communities. So it just highlights some of those systemic challenges that we have in healthcare, and probably it also reflects on some of the challenges that hasn't been looked after in past and needs to be addressed as we build on a response to the pandemic in future. Also, it's important to highlight that these communities also carry a disproportionate burden of comorbidities. So you're talking about diabetes, as we know, it's a highly the risk factors are much more disproportionate in the communities from the South Asian background, and in Australia and in America as well. So you would see that these communities have taken a big burn because of the COVID-19, and we need a much more systemic and health systems focus in improving the capacity of health systems, also to empower these communities.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bhaskar. That's, yeah, it's extremely important to think about these things throughout the pandemic. We actually do have a question from the audience now. So Oren, if you would like to unmute yourself and ask your question, feel free.
Hi, yeah, thank you so much, panelists. This is super interesting. It's obviously very topical for all of us. I'm just really interested in the different COVID strains and whether it's currently being looked at, especially with like the British strains going on, that we don't, I'm wondering whether you guys take that into account when you're studying your COVID patients, and whether we know or whether you guys speculate whether there's different central nervous system effects depending on what strain you're looking at.
Should I answer that? I mean, so that's a really great question. And, I think the problem is it's too early to know. I mean, we started our study back in June, and obviously there were different strains around then, but nobody was talking about it. And certainly it wasn't something that anybody could self-report and say, yes, I had the UK Kent variant, or what, or Brazilian variant, or whatever. So I think it's too early, but I think based on the data that we have, we can start to make predictions because, as I've said, if it turns out that cognitive impairments are linked to the physical symptoms, and then data is emerging that that these different variants may have different levels of severity on the body, the physical impacts. The obvious inference would be that some strains might produce more pronounced or different types of cognitive deficits than others. But I think it's going to be quite a long time before we can unpack all this. I mean, fortunately, we have what is probably the world's largest natural experiment going on right now, with more than 100 million people that can contribute in one way or another. So I think eventually we'll find out the answers to these, but I think it's still early days.
And I might just jump in there with, oh, sorry, go ahead, Dr. Mukherjee.
I want to echo, I think it's the one thing that we are looking at. So we work with the Broad Institute and we do viral genomics. And so we're actually trying to address that question in spinal fluid for individuals. I think one of the key things, so for us, we don't have differences. For us, our circulating variant was D614G at the time of many of our analyses. And I think ultimately this question is important for two reasons. One, it has to be a global scale because we have variants that are different. So one region reporting is going to be very different than South Africa, for example. And then the second thing that I think is extremely important is that a lot of data that we have generated as a neurology group in our situation are biased. These are individuals that have either received imaging, have received some sort of diagnosis or are concerned themselves about a neurological disease. That bias is not a surveillance setting. And so one thing would love to see is starting to see neurological surveillance of individuals with and without neurological disease to try to understand what is sort of the prevalence perhaps of answering that question of viral variants and what's viral interactions, and also then neurological disease.
Great, thanks so much, Dr. Mukherjee. So we do have some more questions here in the chat. So Dr. Brian Corneal, do you want to ask your question?
Okay, I was gonna ask you to skip over me and go to the other trainees and stuff, but I think it is an important question to me. I'm struck, and I'm no expert in this, obviously, so it's a wonderful panel to ask this question regarding long haulers and the sort of post-viral complications that you're seeing. Is the thinking that that's a distinct entity from other sort of post-viral complications that you might see following other diseases that are quite distinct? Is it converging on something common, or is this a distinct entity with COVID?
Well, I'll jump in the absence of anybody else saying anything. I mean, I think we don't know, Brian, to be honest. And I think it's just because we don't have enough data, and partly that's because this is really the first time we've had a situation where there's such a strong impetus to really look at this situation from so many different, so many different ways. So that there are literally, I know this as we sort of struggling to get our data together and get a paper out. There are hundreds of studies just in my little field of looking at, cognitive and mental health repercussions of COVID. But, go back 20 years and look at the SARS outbreak, and yeah, there were sort of follow-up neurological studies, but there was nothing like the attention this has had, and there was certainly not a comprehensive treatment, for example, of what are the cognitive sequelae of the virus. And so I don't think we know. I think we'll end up here with a really good characterization of this virus and the neurological and cognitive impacts of this virus, simply because this has been such a big deal for so many people. It may require another pandemic or two before we can really understand whether it's a generic, the outcomes are generic, or whether they're specific to this virus. But my co-panelists may have specific information about other viruses.
So I mean, like different time and different virus, but I think many of us know that, in 1919, there was the influenza pandemic, and that in the 3-4 decades following that, there were a host of different neurological syndromes that were described that were in some way thought to be connected to a prior infection with influenza virus. I think with hindsight, it appears that many of those associations were epidemiologically tenuous. And so we're not really clear on, the relationship, for example, between influenza virus and some movement disorders or some long-term encephalopathies. But I think there is an opportunity today to do much better in terms of characterizing in a very precise way the longitudinal relationship between acute infection with SARS-CoV-2 and numerous variants of that virus, and some of the longer term neurological outcomes, disentangling the effects of the virus itself from the effects of the host response to the virus, and also the very significant metabolic and physiological effects that moderate and severe, COVID infection can entail. So I think it's going to be painstaking, and I don't think we'll be able to answer that question about long COVID for several years definitively. I think there's a lot of speculation right now, and there's a lot of very hasty conclusions that I think we need to be careful about not jumping into.
Thank you.
Okay, next I believe we have a question from Olivia, if you want to unmute.
Yeah, so I guess my question is wrapping my head around separating physical symptoms and mental health. As like, I could imagine someone who's in a state of distress, just generally from COVID, will naturally have more mental health related issues just as a consequence. And then subsequently that'll potentially affect their cognition. How are you able, at least Dr. Owen, to separate the two and account for something like that?
Yeah, that's a good question, and it's actually I'm going to fold my answer into the next question in the chat as well. I apologize to Justine, but I'm going to answer both questions at the same time, so they're actually related to one another. So, what we're seeing in the data, and it is very preliminary at this point, is that these two things are dissociable. I mean, this is the sort of beauty of something like a factor analysis. When you have many participants, you can tease these things apart. And yes, you're absolutely right that the mental health effects and cognition are the sort of co-occurring in this patient population, and there are many reasons, many sort of obvious reasons why that might be the case. But what we're showing, at least in our analysis so far, is that these two things are dissociable. And I'll give you an example of how we know that. I mean, apart from the fact that they fall out as two factors, the cognition and the physical going together, and the mental health, anxiety and depression separately. Also, for example, in the elderly participants have greater physical symptoms. That won't surprise anybody, but as a consequence, the older you are, the more likely you are also to have cognitive problems. Right, but interestingly, the reverse, the younger you are, the more likely you are to report mental health issues, depression and anxiety. So that's another example of where these things dissociate. And traditionally in neuropsychology, but in cognitive neuroscience, we look for these dissociations because they probably mean that they have different mechanisms. Either there are different brain systems involved, or different pathologies are producing these two effects. But they're separable, so they could both go on in any one individual. You could have both cognitive problems and mental health issues, but they're separable, they're dissociable. So you could have one and not the other. And sort of turning to that sort of second question, many people have said to us, well, maybe this is nothing to do with COVID-19. Maybe it's that, these people are just really stressed about the pandemic. Wouldn't you see these same effects? And we have this beautiful opportunity here to test that. I mentioned in my little sort of blurb at the beginning that we had many hundreds of thousands of people have taken these tests prior to COVID-19. And this gives us a fantastic opportunity to go back and revisit those people. So one thing we've been doing very recently, as a sort of supplement to the original studies, we've been emailing everybody that's ever taken our tests historically and said, hey, come and take them again. Because all of these people, of course, most of them won't have had COVID-19, but all of them have now lived through a pandemic. So it's going to allow us to tease apart the effects of just, the many stresses that people are under, whether it's, homeschooling or losing your job or, wondering where your next meal is going to come from, all of these other stressors that are associated with being in the pandemic for COVID and non-COVID patients, and the effects of the virus itself. So again, that's one of those sort of really interesting little nuggets that I think we're gonna begin to understand perhaps a year from now.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Dr. Owen. So I have a question here for Dr. Stevens. So in one of your papers, you do sort of talk about some of the complications of conducting neuroimaging in COVID-19 patients. So I was just, and there were sort of a mention of, you did sort of mention some of the subphenotypes of the sort of different clinical manifestations of COVID-19 as well. I think in your paper you refer to them as common data elements, or sort of the statistical approach that you take to that. So I was just sort of wondering, can you comment on how these common data elements for COVID-19 or common data elements can sort of help overcome some of the complications for COVID-19 neuroimaging?
Right, so the common data elements is essentially a concept developed by the NIH here in the US to generate a vocabulary that is that researchers can use in designating different disease states. So there are common data elements in just in the realm of neurology. There are common data elements for stroke. There's common data elements for traumatic brain injury. There's common data elements for a number of different neurological disorders, and there's also common data elements outside of the neuroscience domain. The idea is to create a repertoire or sort of an extensive nomenclature that designates both the phenotype as well as imaging, biomarkers, and this has already been done, again, quite extensively in a number of different areas. So the thought was that COVID is emerging as this, it has emerged as this pandemic. It's a complex disease. It's here to stay, even if we're successful in vaccinating and reducing the intensity of the pandemic. The effects of COVID are going to be here for many, many years to come. So the idea was to create a series of modules, experts that would get together and agree on basic vocabularies that we could use to describe patients with COVID-19. So I worked on in a group that was several groups, but the one that this paper that you're referring to was for, I think, common data elements for neuroimaging. And we essentially generate a range of different, specific descriptors, features that can be used to describe changes on CT, on MRI, on PET, on vascular imaging to better understand the impact or the changes that can be seen pathologically in the brain of patients with COVID-19. Again, it's just a step towards a uniform language so that researchers who are describing imaging findings in this population could potentially use the same terms, and so that we can compare apples to apples when we have research that is coming out. That's all. But there's going to be a whole range of other common data elements with regards to the clinical descriptors and also biomarkers, and those will be coming out over the next few months.
Thank you very much, Dr. Stevens. Yeah, having that common nomenclature and everything, I'm sure is very important for this. And so thank you. And now we have a question from Oren, if you'd like to unmute.
Yeah, thank you for all of this. Again, I'm asking another question because I find this topic so interesting, but I'm really curious about the symptom of anosmia. And I'm wondering whether you guys can speculate or what the connection between the virus is and that odd symptom that's so common or seems to be so prevalent within COVID patients.
I think this is a question for Dr. Mukherjee.
I have to say, I'll be honest, I did never entered prior to this thinking about the smell system. I have to say, as it is, my knowledge of the neuroanatomy of smell was not there prior to COVID, and suddenly have to now become there post. And so I will tell you this, I have a really good colleague, and a majority of what I'm telling you comes from my colleague. And so it's Mark Albers, and he's thought about loss of smell in neurodegenerative diseases and has, and I would say this, and he's extremely interested in COVID-19, and we have some projects. The thing is this, in the very beginning, when we thought about the loss of smell, I'll tell you how I figured this out. It was on Twitter. There was a tweet, someone was telling me that there was someone famous and they had lost their smell. And I thought that was such an odd thing, because one of the things with COVID that's fascinating is that it's not really like a blocked up sinus issue that you're having as a trouble. That is not the predominant issue, but loss of smell was just a very common phenomenon. It was happening in individuals that were essentially not intubated. They were otherwise well, but that was their symptom. And at the time, the CDC in the United States did not actually list anosmia on their list of items to get tested for COVID. Anyway, the long story short is, in the very beginning, I thought, as a lot of people did, was that you'd have this loss. There was a person who said the best, is she was a mother and she put her face in her child's nappy and like smelled it and couldn't smell it, and that's how she knew she had lost. But that individual then reported three weeks later return of their smell. And that was what, in the very, very beginning, was what I was thought is that there was this return of smell, sort of, 3 weeks later, and that it was everything was fine. And this has now been reported, up to 90% in some cohorts. The long story short is, in the very beginning, we thought that this could not be, sort of changing of the neurocircuitry, because return of something in 3 weeks usually means that there's some support cells that maybe have been infected, maybe those are dying. Those sestentacular cells are sort of, the problem here. The thing is, though, is that not everybody's returning their smell in 3 weeks. There's some people that are not. So that's the heterogeneity I think Dr. Stevens had spoken about. The other thing that people have also said that I think is super fascinating is that our ability to smell, our subjective, is not the same as objective. So on objective testing, people still have problems, even though they believe that they can smell. And it's very different than the neurodegenerative concepts of Alzheimer's, where they have no sense, maybe not a large sense, that they've actually lost smell. And so there's a very unique pathophysiology here. So this is long-winded saying I don't know the answer to this question. What I am struggling with is whether or not there's an infection of an olfactory sensory neuron. That's one large debate. So there's a Nature Neuroscience paper that came out very sort of, hyped up, I believe in like sort of the November time, that argued that actually that you had infection of olfactory sensory neuron. And that this could then somehow allow for, transmucosal migration into the brain. In human data, that has not been identified. Like that connection hasn't been there. That hasn't been shown necessarily. I struggle with that as a model per se, but that's out there as a thought process. The question ultimately is it loss of support cells? Is it actually rewiring something in sort of a more local milieu that's a problem, and that has to be rewired? That I think is a really open question. It is one that I find now super fascinating. If I will make we're trying to do imaging to look at ex vivo imaging to try to answer that question in an ex vivo sense. Whether you could do it in vivo is a separate question. But I think smell is beyond fascinating. I'm a novice. I'm new to it for the last 6 to 8 months. So, but I do have to say, if you're looking for thoughts on it, there's a lot of people who are interested in this question. Very open.
I can just maybe add that even in this little domain of analyzing the symptomatology around the sense of smell in COVID-19, there's heterogeneity, right? So, and we've seen this in many reports actually. There's a subgroup of people who report transient loss of smell sensation, maybe sometimes even just a few hours to a few days or a few weeks. And then there's other people who seem to have durable, long-lasting loss of olfaction. And it sort of begs the question, I strongly suspect that these entities are biologically distinct. Some people have argued that maybe the transient loss of smell, maybe occurring over just a few days, could just be due to some sort of nasal congestion, as you see in many common colds, whereas the more durable symptoms are possibly due to damage or in direct invasion of the olfactory nerves. And then the whole smell story sort of begs an additional question as to whether in some individuals, or maybe who have certain susceptibilities, the virus may use the olfactory nerves as an entry point to enter the brain and cause encephalitis. I don't think that story has ever been demonstrated mechanistically, but it is kind of an intriguing thought, I guess.
Wonderful, thanks so much. So the next question we have is from Aaron.
Hello, I was wondering whether there is any evidence to suggest that certain brain regions are more affected than others with regards to the virus. Essentially, if there are any kind of COVID hotspots in the brain.
I can tackle maybe, I think, Aaron, you had put on the autopsy, so I'll tackle it there. But I mean, I'm very curious about those who are doing radiographic findings or sort of radiographic studies, what they're seeing. the autopsies. So I want to put into context. We've had millions of people who die from COVID-19. We have approximately 160 brain autopsies. So let's just put this in sort of a perspective of some sort. And so in that group of individuals, I would have to say that in general, we don't see a hotspot. People have focused heavily on olfactory frontal for reasons that Oren had mentioned about the loss of smell. People have looked at brainstem quite heavily, and because of respiration and the thought of maybe is this Ondi's curse or something else in the respiratory drive that's causing problems. And people have looked at cerebellum, people have looked at as well as hippocampus. In general, I don't know if there's a particular hotspot. There's heterogeneity, I think, is like a catchword of the day. It's sort of like the it word of COVID-19. And so there are heterogeneous responses because the reason is the path to get to death is heterogeneous as well. And so many, if you were mechanically ventilated, maybe you were on ECMO, maybe you were on multi-organ failure, there's a lot of things that got you to death, unfortunately. And there were probably a lot of other issues that you may have had prior to COVID that got you to autopsy. And so in general, I would say that there's not a hotspot that we've identified. Now, the interesting pathological and sort of viral host questions have come up with choroid plexus, and whether or not that is an area that we've traditionally under sort of looked at, I guess, in autopsy series. Also, obviously, the meninges are not that easy, the olfactory bulb itself. But in general, I would say that we don't have a signature, is probably how I would frame it, for is there a COVID-specific hotspot?
I think it will be too premature for us to comment that there's a particular hotspot yet. But of course, there's a hypothesis that the particular brain spots where you've got a higher expression of ACE2 receptors, probably those are the areas where you're more likely to hurt more. But it's just, we're shooting in the stars, actually. We just got more studies, more neuropathological studies and imaging to corroborate any of those findings.
Great, thank you so much.
Yes, thank you very much. And our next question is going to be from Justine.
Yes, thanks. I was wondering if the COVID-19 may trigger other disease or disorder in patients who are not diagnosed before, like epilepsy, if there is some link or not between COVID-19 and new diagnostic.
Beg your pardon, can you repeat the question, please?
I was wondering if there may be some link between like someone who had the COVID-19 and several months after develop a disease or disorder such as epilepsy, if this can be related to this first COVID-19 things or if it's just life.
There's no causal link yet that has established, the presentation of epileptic symptoms in patients infected with COVID-19 yet. But it'll be interesting to say that the long COVID studies may prove it otherwise.
Great, thanks so much. So a question I had, I guess, so kind of tying back to what Dr. Mukherjee and Dr. Busker had said about sort of the multifactorial diseases and how they might be more impacted in terms of severity, and just sort of relating that to Dr. Owen, what you're looking at. And I'm just sort of wondering whether the multifactorial diseases, or if you're sort of interested in looking at whether these diseases are associated with different physical symptoms, and whether that would play a role in the sort of linked to the objective cognitive measures that you're looking at.
Sorry, was that directed at me?
Yes.
Oh, right. Okay. Sorry. Can you just repeat the question?
Yes.
I got distracted when you directed it at two of the other co-panelists at the beginning of the sentence.
Sorry about that. So yes, I was just sort of giving a shout out to Dr. Mukherjee and Dr. Bhaskar as they had sort of discussed the multifactorial diseases that sort of play a role with or in COVID severity. And I was just sort of wondering whether you were interested in looking at this sort of in terms of whether this relates to physical symptoms or maybe relates to differences in physical symptoms, and whether this would play a role in sort of the cognitive measures that you're looking at.
Very much so. I mean, I think it's, I mean, one of the reasons why, I mean, like somebody else has already said here, it was Dr. Stevens, I mean, early on in the pandemic, I thought, well, you know, cognitive neuroscience has nothing to offer this pandemic. I should really stay out of this, despite many people knocking on my door saying you should really start to look at these patients. I thought, well, no, we should concentrate on, you know, vaccines and tracing and, you know, all sorts of other seemingly more important things. But as the pandemic sort of ramped up, and when we launched the study, there were 8 million cases worldwide, and that was in June of last year. You know, there are now more than 100 million, and it sort of became apparent that people were starting to you know, report these sort of additional cognitive deficits and describing themselves as long haulers and these sorts of things. And I mean, one of the things that really concerns me, which, sorry, I'm getting to answer your question, is that, you know, where are we going to be a year, 2 years, 5 years from now? Once, you know, once we've vaccinated everybody and maybe we've brought the virus under control, that's great. You know, it's fine. People will stop dying. People will stop, you know, having this terrible respiratory disease. But, you know, but what if there are long-term consequences and cognitive consequences? What if it means that people can't return to their jobs? What if it means, you know, people can't carry out their activities of daily living? And when you've got 100 million people, it could be a very small percentage of people who are profoundly affected in this way, and it still adds up to an awful lot of people. And that's going to be a huge economic and societal burden. And that's really my motivation now, is I think we really need to understand this, and we need to understand who's being affected. Is it, you know, depending on your physical symptoms, are you more or less likely to be affected? Simply because, you know, to put it sort of bluntly, in a year or maybe, you know, 5 years from now, there are going to be an awful lot of people that don't know what their status is. You know, is it reasonable? Will it be reasonable 5 years from now to say, I still can't come back to work because I'm cognitively not back to normal? We have to understand that, because there are so many people involved, and maybe that won't be a reasonable thing to say. Maybe we'll establish that this is something that, you know, the cognitive impacts only, you know, last 3 months, or they only last a year, or maybe we'll find that only people that had X, Y, Z really have long-term cognitive consequences. You know, maybe only people that were ventilated or whatever. But we really, and again, this sort of speaks to the variance issue as well. You know, maybe it's only people that had certain variants that have these. We're going to have to understand this, because this has had such a massive effect on society that if we don't understand it, it's just going to be impossible to deal with people, from issues from, you know, insurance claims to absenteeism to, you know, all sorts of effects on society, which will knock on to the economy, will present themselves. And in many ways, this might be, you know, this could be a bigger problem than the initial pandemic itself if we don't really understand it.
I think it's just building on what Adrian is saying. I think it's helpful to try to differentiate the signal from the noise, right? So, and the reason I'm saying this is because if we just focus on the moderate and severe categories, so those patients, let's say, who are admitted to the intensive care unit with COVID-19 disease, we've known actually for the past 15, 20 years that survivors of critical illness, a very significant proportion of them go on to experience major cognitive impairments. Many of them have psychological problems. Many of them are functionally disabled, unable to return to work, and their quality of life is abysmal. So simply being a survivor of intensive care actually heavily stacks the deck against you, right? And so the question is there something that is actually more specific about this virus, or are we just seeing, at least in the case of these ICU survivors with COVID-19, are we just seeing the effects, the toxic effects of being in an intensive care unit, being exposed to major physiological disturbances, being exposed to all sorts of pharmacological toxins, and being essentially restrained and listening to alarms for 3 weeks in a row without any sleep. I mean, these are, you know, the intensive care unit is a very, very aggressive environment. And I think it's not surprising that many people who survive it are disabled in the long term. So one of the tasks I think for at both the population level, but also at the mechanistic level, is going to be to unravel the effects of, you know, simply being very sick and being in intensive care from the effects that are more specific to the virus.
Thank you very much. So we have time for one last question and then we will be wrapping things up. So I will ask Keiko, I apologize if I said your name wrong, to unmute if you'd like to ask your question.
Thank you. Yeah, my name is Keiko, and I'm a master's student doing tinnitus research. And since we talked about smell, I would like to know, I've heard a lot about COVID patients ending up with tinnitus and sometimes dizziness as well. And I'd like to know if, even without the ototoxic drugs, can you speak to any known or possible impacts to the auditory system that would cause tinnitus? So even things like specific areas in the brainstem, the dorsal-cochlear nucleus or the inferior colliculus, anything along that pathway.
I mean, I can't answer the question because my answer is I don't know. But I'd be interested to know if there is any. I mean, I think you said that tinnitus has been reported. I mean, I hadn't read that. It's probably maybe the first I've heard. I don't know whether any of anybody else on this panel who's closer to the patients themselves sees a high incidence of tinnitus in their patients.
So there are reports of tinnitus. Tinnitus is hard. It's also like anosmia. So I think, as Dr. Stevens had mentioned, we are so focused on hospitalized individuals, and then you're taking pieces of those at that group. And so when a lot of the studies that have now been retrospective cohort studies in general, they've relied on electronic medical record. Tinnitus is not usually the dominant thing that somehow comes into play. So that actually happened with anosmia in the very beginning. So we've done electronic looking, and you can sort of see the rise of anosmia suddenly coming up after sort of news reports in sort of the medical lore. And so my sense is the same is a problem. It's underreported in hospitalized settings specifically. And so whatever estimates are there are a variety. There's anywhere from, you can go from 5%, you can probably find some cohort series that say 50 to 60%. So I think that variance speaks to the fact that we don't know. The answer in terms of autopsy, I would have to say that the vast majority of individuals probably have not looked directly at certain locations in cases. There is one autopsy study that did find viral protein staining in cranial nerves, so glossopharyngeal nerve, for example, but I don't actually know, and I'd have to go back, take a look to see if there's, what other nerves were identified as cranial nerves. And so theoretically, you can't identify it in cranial nerves, so peripheral cranial nerve, and not into the central nuclei. And so, so that's a long-winded answer to say, I don't know, nor do I actually know that that's been such a very, very hot focus for at least the autopsy series individuals.
Thank you. The cranial nerve story is interesting, and since most of the cranial nerves are issued from the brainstem, it also ties in with this emerging signal that the brainstem seems potentially to be like one of those hotspots, among others, that seems particularly susceptible to damage in the setting of moderate and severe COVID-19. And this has been demonstrated in autopsy studies as well as in imaging studies. There appears to be almost like a kind of rhombencephalitis, sort of inflammation or inflammatory disease of the brainstem that occurs at least in a subset of patients, and which may account for some of these very interesting manifestations, not just things like tinnitus, but for instance, the lack of respiratory drive in profoundly hypoxic patients, or the very atypical high sedative dose requirements for many patients who are critically ill with COVID-19, often receiving extraordinarily high doses of, opioids and benzodiazepines to keep them sedated in intensive care unit. The suggestion is that there could be some profound brainstem impairment that is occurring in some of these patients.
Thank you very much for that, all the answers. So we're gonna wrap up now. So thank you all so much for being part of our panel today. It was so interesting to be able to talk to you guys and hear all about your research and your perspective on these questions. Your time and knowledge is greatly appreciated by us all. I just also wanted to quickly thank the SONGS executives for this whole meeting. And up next, we will have an award ceremony and closing remarks in this room. I'll also point out quickly that Dr. Owens posted in the chat, if anyone has had COVID-19, you are welcome to complete his study. And Dr. Mukherjee has suggested some books if you're interested too. So again, thank you all so much for coming today. It's been a great pleasure getting to speak with all you brilliant scientists and doctors.